Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar of the Center for Geopolitics. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the center and the co-lead of the Baltic Geopolitics program at the Center for Geopolitics. Our topic this afternoon is civil defense in the Baltic, subtitled From Tallinn to Berlin. This event lies at the confluence really of three interests that the Center has pursued for some time. The first, of course, is Baltic geopolitics. The second is Germany. And thirdly, our relationship with the Hans Seidel Stiftung, which is now, I think, in its fourth or fifth year. We've had many very interesting events that we've put on together, and I'm glad that the Stiftung is represented by Dr. Martin Michael Richter this afternoon, and he's going to conclude proceedings after I have opened them. It's my great pleasure to introduce as the chair of our first panel, and he will in turn introduce that panel, my colleague Dr. Trevelyan Wing, who is one of our Baltic Research Fellows. He is an expert on the geopolitics of the Baltic, particularly the energy geopolitics of the Baltic. He is fluent in German, Swedish, many other languages. Trevelyan, I hand over to you and take it away.
Thank you very much. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure indeed to welcome you here to Pembroke College, Cambridge, for what promises to be a fascinating and timely and important discussion on the topic From Tallinn to Berlin, Civil Preparedness and Defense in the Baltic Sea region in a time of rising geopolitical uncertainty. And thank you again very much, Brendan, for opening our proceedings today. In the face of growing tensions and evolving security threats, the Greater Baltic has emerged as a strategic focal point and laboratory for national efforts to develop improved deterrence, societal resilience and readiness, and stronger civil defense capabilities. Today's proceedings, co-organized and co-hosted by the University of Cambridge's Center for Geopolitics and the Hans Seidel Foundation, assembles leading experts to examine these critical and complex challenges confronting governments right across the Baltic Sea region. This conference explores these rapidly evolving security threats, from hybrid and cyber warfare to other gray zone challenges, the imperative to better protect the critical national infrastructure upon which our societies and economies rely, both on land and at sea, and how countries around the Baltic are responding and what they might do better on this vital front. Drawing on these lessons, the following proceedings will also discuss opportunities for cross-border cooperation in this arena, as well as the roles and contributions of NATO, the European Union, civil society, and the private sector. I'm sure there'll be much to learn here. Indeed, these are themes that resonate far beyond the shores of the Baltic, as countries the world over seek to build more resilient and secure societies in an age of growing uncertainty. Now, without further ado, let's progress to our first panel, rather appropriately titled The Threats, How Prepared Are We? So I now invite our panelists for the first panel to come up and join me, and then we'll get started in a minute. Thank you. Right, as you can see, joining me to delve into this first topic is a distinguished panel of experts, led by, today, joining us and starting us off, Commodore Andy James, who currently serves as a deputy director within the Defense Nuclear Organization in London. Commodore James has over 25 years' experience in both the reserves and the Royal Navy, where his early career was focused on seagoing roles in operational submarines deployed around the world. Since then, he has served on the staff at Britannia Royal Naval College and in headquarters roles, including at US Central Command, twice in Navy Command Headquarters, and UK Strategic Command, and now in 3 different roles at the Ministry of Defense. Andy, welcome. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good afternoon. Good, you can hear me. First of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me back. So it is a real privilege to be here and speak with you. I'm very conscious I'm amongst some real heavyweights in terms of other speakers, and I feel a little bit daunted in that regard. I should probably also open just to say that the views you'll hear from me are mine and not necessarily those of the Royal Navy or the Ministry of Defence, but I hope where there is a difference, where there is a point of contention, I'll make that clear as we go through. I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian given the theme and regional focus for today by starting on the other side of the world. Forgive me, there is a bit of rationale there, but I'll get to that. I want to talk a little bit about US and China in the context of understanding US views towards Europe. And so I'll work my way back towards Europe and the Baltic through that lens. I'm a little bit jaundiced maybe because I was in Washington last week and it's all very fresh in my mind. But then I will focus back into something a little closer to my own area of expertise and talk a little bit about the maritime, particularly the underwater environment and the grey zone that presents, and hopefully lead in slightly more neatly to the following speakers. So I'm going to start, as I said, on the other side of the world with the US and China. Why? Well, because, as I said, I think it's helpful to understand how the US view the threat, and I do mean the global threat, for us to be able to understand how they are acting and responding. And I'm very struck by some of the comments and observations that I've heard over a number of years, but most particularly in the last year or two, maybe, from US counterparts. And in particular, that is their view of the threat that China poses. So just bear with me, and I'm going to start there. There's a very particular view, I judge, within US, particularly military and sort of security policy areas, with respect to their view of the threat that China poses. Maybe this view is not universal, but I do think it's a prevailing one. And as I said, I think it's a helpful starting off point for our understanding of their approach to the global security situation and therefore particularly Europe. This view is not just a China rising one, which is a familiar one and has been much talked and written about. It's not just about the threat that a rising power poses to the status quo. It's something more than that, I judge, and it's framed around a very particular focus, Taiwan-orientated, and a timeline very proximate towards conflict. And this is a prevailing thought amongst many in that US system. So, whether you frame this as you may have heard of the Davidson window in a sort of very proximate sense of what that's posing. So, that's my starting assertion, that there's this prevailing view amongst many in the US system of the real and proximate threat of conflict with China. Now, I judge that this is a helpful starting point to understand how they're started acting more globally, and particularly with respect to Europe. It's more than just arguments about equity and burden sharing, sharing responsibility for security. That critique of Europe prospering under a US umbrella, it's more than that. It's more than just a share of GDP on defence spending type argument, however valid those things might be. And just to be clear, I'm not asking you to buy into the narrative that I've portrayed. I'm not asking you to buy into the Davidson window sort of idea. There are plenty of critiques of it, but just to accept that that's a prevailing view and is shaping thinking. And so I judge there's a genuine concern amongst my military counterparts and policymakers in Washington that they're going to have to divert resources and effort away from Europe in order to tackle a China problem now, very soon. And that is starting to shape how they view both a military footprint perspective, but also how they're starting to shape their political decision-making for Europe. They cannot deal with a quantitatively already superior China and one that is growing qualitatively all the time and keep a focus on Europe. So I think there's that set, and that's a real proximate feeling amongst US policymakers. So much of this thinking predates the current Trump administration, of course. You might judge that the narrative and the way it's framed is rather different now than it was 12 months ago. I think that's a helpful lens to look at some of the decision-making that's coming out of Washington with respect to Europe. So whether you want to view that in a different way or not, or challenge, I'm very happy to pick that up in questions. But as I say, I think it's a helpful starting point, and I suspect we'll tend to keep coming back to the US as an important actor in, a traditionally important actor in European security, and this dynamic is definitely playing out for me at the moment. Right, having started in China, I want to drag ourselves back to slightly closer to home, and talk a little bit about where and what do I see as the threats in Europe, and particularly in the Baltic, and hopefully that cues us up for the subsequent speakers today. So, notwithstanding global threats, in terms of proximity, capability, and intent, hopefully no surprise, Russia as a real challenge to the UK and European security. That's not to dismiss non-state actors and other threats, but that is definitely in the front of our minds collectively. There's no doubt that Russia has been chastened by the Ukraine war from a military perspective. It's not gone as they had anticipated, but that shouldn't lead us to underestimate them, both in their ability to endure. I don't think we'd underestimate them in their ability to endure anyway, or to learn and adapt. And I think we see quite a lot of that. Seen quite a lot of that over the last couple of years. As is so often the case in wartime, that cycle of technological and tactical development has tightened and sped up dramatically in the last couple of years, and that is starting to permeate through not just in the Ukraine theatre, but more generally across Russian military capability. Many parts of Russia's armed forces are going to take some time to regenerate. There's no doubt about that, but not all. And if I take my own particular area, which is submarines and submarine operations and the broader underwater environment, I think that is an exception to that general point. We continue to see clear investment in Russian submarine and underwater capabilities. That fundamentally hasn't changed. And despite challenges all over the place, that is still very much a focus of their military interest. Why? Well, I think there are probably two reasons that are worth exploring. Russia wants to be able to hold NATO at risk, to degrade our ability to operate at will, and they need to be able to do this at a level below the threshold of Article 4, let alone Article 5, action by NATO, classic grey zone type activity. There are lots of ways of doing that, and I suspect we'll hear some more of those as this afternoon goes on. But I assert that the underwater environment presents a really valuable means for them to exert that grey zone activity against NATO. And why is that? Put simply, because it is easy to hide in the underwater environment. It's easy to hide yourself, your actions, and your intentions, so long as you have the technical capability to do so. It's not easy to operate in the underwater environment. It's a hostile and difficult environment to operate in. But if you do have that capability, it offers you a real avenue to explore that grey zone friction with potential adversaries. Russia does have that capability and does have that intent. Secondly, it's worth linking ourselves back to nuclear deterrence, which obviously is a familiar broad topic for us, for me. Again, another reason why Russia has continued to invest in its submarine and underwater capability. For Russia, for the UK, very obviously, but for a number of other nations, that environment and the ability to hide is the rationale for using the underwater environment as the environment from which to pose a nuclear deterrence option, and therefore it's always going to be strongly contested between nuclear powers within NATO and between NATO and Russia. So that offers another lens through which to view it. I think I'll very quickly close with the second half of the question of this opening session, which is how prepared are we? The short answer always is it depends. It depends slightly on which aspects you're looking at. I'll perhaps make a distinction between two areas. The first is the classic submarine threat posed by Russia. In that respect, I judge we are well prepared. We've been at this for a long time. There's been a lot of careful investment and effort applied in this area. We need to continue doing that to retain our edge, because the adversary is also seeking to invest and drive technological advantage. But we're operating at that level today. More generally, though, and particularly with respect to seabed warfare, the threat posed by underwater critical national infrastructure to critical national infrastructure, some of the more novel actions that we're now seeing in that environment, we're playing a bit of catch-up. I think we've witnessed some developments in Russia and elsewhere on this subject for a little while, but have taken a while to get into the action of actually being able to counter them. That is changing, but we are playing a bit of catch-up there, and I think that axis presents a real opportunity in the near term for Russia to pose a threat against us. The Baltic region is a very obvious region where that can play out, and I think is a good way to end my comments. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions at the end of the panel.
Great, thank you very much. That was, I think that framed our discussion really, really nicely, and I'm sure we will return to much of that in the Q&A later. However, first, before we do that, we of course have two more speakers to go. And I'm really, really happy to welcome our next speaker here today, Henrik Praks, who's a research fellow in the Security and Resilience Program of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. So again, very much on the front lines of the discussion here today. Between 2020 and 2024, he worked as a senior analyst at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki, Finland. And earlier in his career served in various positions within the Estonian Ministry of Defense, focusing on defense and security policy, regional security, NATO, and EU defense issues. He has also lectured in strategic studies at the Baltic Defense College and served as director of the annual Baltic Conference on Defense. Henrik, you're most welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and very happy to be here to provide a perspective from Tallinn, as the program says. In my introductory remarks, I will just lay out in generally a broader threat picture as we see, let's say, from the region or Estonia in particular, leaving aside the conventional military aspect, which is a different one, but focusing on the so-called hybrid or gray zone threats, because we in Estonia especially, and the other Baltic countries, have a long history of being targets of Russian hybrid pressure. 2007 events in Estonia, I mean the so-called Bronze Soldier crisis, the cyber attacks accompanying it are well known. But currently, wider Russian threat is real and significant, and we are basically under attack on several fronts across the whole region, I would say, and beyond that in Europe as a general. Because we have, on one hand, of course, hot conventional war still ongoing with no end in sight despite all the negotiations and in Ukraine. But at the same time, there is also going on a covert hybrid or gray zone campaign against Europe by Russia. And for Russia, they are very much interlinked, because Russia sees that it is in the conflict with collective West. And I think even if some kind of ceasefire or freeze or some kind of change in Ukraine is achieved through the negotiations, Russia will not stop the larger conflict because it has become part of Russian, basically the Putinist Russia's new identity. The Baltic Sea region is in very many aspects focus area of these kind of Russian activities. There are different reasons. I mean, the Nordic Baltic countries and Poland have been consistently among the staunchest supporters of Ukraine and the strongest advocate of punishing Russia. But there is obviously also the geographical aspect. Geography matters. I mean, we are the bordering region of Russia and the Baltic Sea despite all the claims of being a NATO lake, is not. It cannot be a NATO lake because Russia is also through St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad area a coastal state of a Baltic Sea. Well, what are the Russia's aims? The general Russian political aim is in undertaking those activities is destabilizing Europe, trying to create a kind of a fear and insecurity in our nations, fuel tensions, etc. Short-term aim undermine support to Ukraine, but longer-term aim is, of course, still the reordering of a European security architecture along the lines, basically, like Russia was proposed before the start of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in December 2021. And we have seen in last statements by Russian leadership, basically, they are still following those lines. There are, of course, also operational aims, testing reactions in both national and internationally, how NATO, European Union are reacting, trying to shift also the boundaries of acceptability, that something which would be considered not normal behavior beforehand would now, after it has been applied already, considered a kind of almost a new normal. I mean, the tactics Russia is using are well known. I mean, they are used across Europe. I will not spend time on going in details in all of them, just listing. I mean, of course, we have the cyber aspects, but it is still in the region goes mostly unnoticed for the public. But it is certainly important. For example, in Estonian case, we are well known for our digitalization. I mean, our whole state system basically is digital. There is no paper copies. So cyber security, cyber hygiene is extremely important, and that actually applies to our nations. Also, there are disinformation and influence operations. Disinformation, I think Russia is currently mostly concentrating in Europe on the bigger nations, Germany, France, etc. But it's, of course, undertaking also those activities in other countries. And often also Russia as a brand is rather toxic in our region. Open association with Russia would not gain popularity or to you it is using this kind of alternative ecosystems, kind of anti-everything, anti-establishment, anti-conspiracy theorists and etc. to push its messages. There is, I mean, not directing Estonia, but the other countries has been well known is the instrumentalization of migration, mainly, most notably through Russia's ally or basically vassal Belarus against Poland and Lithuania and also Latvia. But Russia also used it 2 years ago against Finland, resulting in the closure of bilateral border. There are other aspects also, like Russia's use of psychological pressure. For example, in the Baltic states, Russia has put on its own internal wanted lists several politicians and other well-known figures for kind of anti-Russian policies or especially related to the history. I think the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, I suppose she was put into that list also as Estonian Prime Minister, and probably she's still on that list currently. Now, the new development which we are seeing currently across Europe and obviously also in our region is the use of sabotage, arson, vandalism activities, kind of kinetic attacks, which are mostly ordered by the Russian military intelligence GRU, and they have been targeting, for example, extensively in Poland and Lithuania, but also there have been a lot of attempts prevented in other countries. There was just recently, a few days ago, news from arrests in Germany who have had similar cases also in Estonia of attacks planned or executed or planned against some transport infrastructure or businesses like Poland. Just a week or two ago, Polish Prime Minister came public that the big fire, which a year ago or something like that, I think it was last year, which destroyed a big shopping mall in Warsaw, was ordered or organized by Russian services. And Russia is, it's not using its, own operatives itself for those, but recruiting people often with criminal background or economic hardships with such, let's say, wider Russian-speaking or Russia-influenced world. We don't need to be Russian citizens or ethnic Russians, but can be also some, let's say, Ukrainians or Moldovians, or we have had cases, I think, also with people of Serbian or Bulgarian citizenship in such activities. Now, coming before I end to the sea side, or the critical infrastructure at sea, and the issues which the previous speaker also mentioned. The sea is a very difficult environment physically and also legally, because of the different legal regimes where coastal states don't have really much authority beyond the territorial sea in the international waters or exclusive economic zones they have in the Baltic Sea. And we have seen in the last 1.5 years, I think now we have had 4 major, and there have been, I think, some smaller incidents also, but 4 major incidents of cable and pipeline cuts by dragging of anchors by various commercial ships in the Baltic Sea, and they have affected almost all cables connecting Baltic countries with the other countries on which use the sea route. It is highly unlikely that such dramatic rise of such an incident would be accident, but at the same time it is very difficult, has proven to be proved. All the ships have been identified. It has been rather easy or quick. Finns apprehended the ship, and also I think Swedes for a very short time, which had been dragging the anchor, but there have been no attribution of guilt so far. Also, obviously, there are ongoing investigations, because it is always very difficult to hide behind this slogan of accident, that something just anchor dropped and we didn't notice, and seaman skills are bad, and etc. And even difficult is to prove, even if you can prove that the captain maybe intentionally dropped the anchor, or somebody on the ship, that it was done on orders of, let's say, Russian or any other services. And related, interlinked to this issue, but separate itself, very big security issue in the Baltic Sea, but also beyond this, the issue of course, of a Russian shadow fleet, which poses a big environmental, also maritime safety and security risks, has been involved in some of those cable cut incidents, also not in all of them. And actually, last week, we had also a first case when Russia clearly associated itself with a shadow fleet, when the Estonian authorities, Estonia has been one of the most active nations in the Baltic Sea, controlling the suspicious ships, asking insurance or flag status, etc. And there was one ship which had lost its flag status because of sanctions actually at that time imposed by UK. Yeah? Now it's also in the newest EU sanctions package, which was approved on Monday. So it was a flagless ship which every nation can stop, but it didn't follow the orders, continued the course, and actually a Russian fighter plane arrived over the Gulf of Finland to escort it to Russia, and also during this process, for a short period, violated Estonia's airspace over the Baltic Sea. So it was a clearly first sign that those ships sailing under various flags of convenience of various island or African or whatever nations are actually in one or other way also linked to Russia. To sum up, I think it is safe to conclude that Russia will continue to test our reactions, adjust its tactics. It is possible that it will try to escalate further, especially if it doesn't get pushback or strong responses. Because if Russia believes that we will not escalate, why it should stop? And that, I think, at the moment, it is more prepared to act against us than we are to act against them. So that's a short introduction from my side.
Very well. Aita, Henrik, for that very thought-provoking presentation. And again, I'm sure that we'll delve into that during the discussion to follow. We have one more speaker, and I'm just going to ask my colleague to come up and help us. We'll have a presentation here as well to look at. But last but certainly not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Martin, CBE. Dr. Martin has more than 30 years' experience in the UK national security arena, where he held several senior positions, including as former head of the UK Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, now known as the National Protective Security Authority. He currently serves as Professor of Practice in Coventry University's London-based Protective Security Lab, advises various UK government entities, and is a Distinguished Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a member of the UK Police Science Council, and an Honorary Fellow of Imperial College London. Perhaps most importantly, for those of us in this city, however, Dr. Martin earned his PhD here at Cambridge and served as a junior lecturer and fellow of Wolfson College. So Paul, welcome back, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and the presentation is ready to go.
Thank you. I must admit I'm suffering from a healthy dose of imposter syndrome because I'm avowedly not a subject matter expert in geopolitics or the Baltics. My background, as you've heard, is really in the national security world. So I thought what I would do is approach this problem sort of at right angles, which is to consider that we have geopolitical threat actors who generate risks to national security and societal well-being. We do stuff like security and national and societal resilience to help manage those risks, to protect ourselves. And I think we could do better in terms of understanding the way we go about doing that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the principles and concepts behind national resilience and national security. So next slide, please. The first thing to say is that if you're worrying about risks to your nation, there are certainly plenty to choose from. There are risks that have materialized, that are here now. We've got, war in Europe. We've got conflict in the Middle East. We've got climate change. We've got mass migration. We have cyber attacks every day. We've got disinformation. Not all of them arising from geopolitical conflict, but some of them. There's also another bunch of risks that we need to worry about, which are bad things that haven't happened yet, but which might happen. And that was certainly something that preoccupied me when I was being paid to worry about national infrastructure. Next slide, please. This unreadable chart gives you the kind of UK government view of the current national risk picture. I will just give you a few thoughts arising from this. This is from the current iteration, the unclassified public version of the UK's National Risk Register, in which all of the things we should be worried about are assessed in terms of the likelihood that they'll happen and the impact, the amount of damage they will do if they do happen. And there's a lot of them, as you can see. On the top row, which is the catastrophic impact stuff, generally lower likelihood, fortunately. They include such things as a pandemic, or should I say another pandemic, the next pandemic. Just as an aside, in answer to the question, how well prepared are we, it's worth noting, we're already forgetting about it, the 2019 pandemic found the UK and other countries far less well prepared than they thought they were, and far less well prepared than they needed to be. And some quite shocking things have come out of the public inquiry. And I think there are reasons for that, which I'm happy to go into. Also along the top line, we've got large-scale CBRN attacks and a failure of the national electricity transmission system, which may or may not be caused by malicious actors. And again, just as an aside, I will note that in the mid-1990s, this is one of those terrible things that might have happened but didn't happen. In the mid-1990s, the Provisional IRA had this is a matter of public record, had a very well-developed plot to destroy the electricity supply to Greater London. They'd identified the substations around London, transformers sitting in fields, and they had built devices to put into the cooling vanes of the transformers that would all have gone off on the same day, taken out the electricity supply for the whole of Greater London, probably had consequential effects on the national grid. They were stopped, fortunately. There was action taken by the police and security services, but had it happened, it would have been truly catastrophic. So failures of infrastructure, they might happen through accident, they might happen through natural events like severe weather, they can happen through malign threat actors. On the high likelihood, the right-hand column, stuff that is most likely to happen, we have such sadly familiar things as terrorist attacks in venues and public spaces, something I used to worry about when I was Director of Security for the UK Parliament, assassination of a high-profile public figure, I should say another assassination. Joe Cox MP was murdered while I was working in Parliament. And we've had a number of plots recently. You'll have heard about arrests in London in the last couple of weeks of Iranian nationals allegedly targeting Iranian journalists who are critical of the Iranian regime. So we've had a resurgence of state-sponsored terrorism. Back in the 80s and 90s, all terrorism was largely state-sponsored terrorism. That went away to be replaced really by predominantly Islamist extremist terrorism. State-sponsored terrorism is back, notably as practiced by Russia. We've had in London, we've had the murder of Litvinenko using a radiological weapon, and we had the Salisbury attacks using a nerve agent, and Iran. So there's a lot going on to worry about. On a methodological point, for reasons best known to the officials who do this, the National Risk Register now only looks at acute risk, stuff that happens quite quickly, events. What it doesn't cover are the chronic, slow-burning, slow-boiling risks, the boiling the frog kind of risks that we find all too easy to ignore. So we have such things as China, climate change, microbial resistance, and serious and organised crime, which are sort of corroding the integrity of society, but they're hard to pin down to particular events. Another thing that policymakers, in my experience, need to be regularly reminded of, particularly the more theoretical ones, is that it is possible, according to the laws of physics, it is possible for more than one bad thing to happen at the same time, otherwise known in the trade as a cluster. Next slide, please. I want to mention another emerging risk that I'm currently very enthused about, and I've been doing some work with colleagues at the Alan Turing Institute in London, which is the emerging risk from AI insiders. Now, we're all too familiar in the security world with insiders. These are humans that we have trusted, we've brought them inside, we've given them access to things we care about, and then they betray that trust by behaving badly. I mean, the archetypal insider is the spy, the individual working, say, in a sensitive government department, but spying on behalf of a hostile foreign state. Now, as we've increasingly handed over tasks that were previously performed by humans to intelligent machines, some of those same issues are already arising through the actions of AI insiders, entities we've trusted, but which may cause us harm. Those of you of a certain age may recognize the reference here to 2001: A Space Odyssey, in which the malevolent, super-intelligent computer HAL starts bumping off all the astronauts in order to maintain the integrity of its mission. So AI insiders, another emerging risk. Next slide, please. People talk a lot about threats and risks, and in the security world, they often get quite confused and confusing. They're not the same thing. This is really how people in the national security world think about risk, security risk. It starts with human threat actors, conceivably now AI threat actors. They have intentions to do harmful things, but they must also have capability. The world is full of people with malevolent intentions who lack the capability to do anything. States have the capability to do it, but usually, fortunately, they don't have the intention. If you have both intention and capability, you have a threat. You have the likelihood or possibility that somebody is going to do something harmful. In order for them to succeed, though, you have to have gaps and weaknesses in your defenses, vulnerabilities that they can exploit. If you've got really, really impregnable security, it doesn't matter what the threat is. But if threat and vulnerability come together, you have this creates likelihood. So the combination of threat and vulnerability gives you the likelihood that somebody, a threat actor, a hostile foreign state, a terrorist or whatever, will carry out an attack, and the attack will succeed and it will cause harm. It will have impact. So it creates impact, harm, harmful consequences, damage. Risk is simply the probability of that. So it's the amount of harm you can expect to accrue if you don't do something about it. Two things worth mentioning about risk which are widely misunderstood, particularly in the national security context. One is that the risks are intensely dynamic and adaptive, not like some health and safety risks or engineering risks or insurance risks or financial risks or engineering risks. National security risks emanate from intelligent malign actors who are adapting what they do in response to what we do. So the moment, for example, you tighten up your cybersecurity defenses, they're immediately innovating and finding a way around them. So it's a perpetual arms race. It's very dynamic. The risks keep changing. You've got to run to stand still. It's very, very Red Queen territory. And another important thing which catches a lot of people flat-footed is that the threat actors, by and large, don't advertise who they are or where they are or what they're planning to do. They're largely covert. Some of them are very, very covert. Some of them are so covert, we've no idea who they are or where they are. And for the really high-end threats, we rely on secret intelligence to find out what's going on. And that is, by its nature, always incomplete and fragmentary. And this gives rise to a common recurring error, which is people mistaking the absence of evidence of risk with evidence of absence of risk. I can't see a problem, therefore there is no problem. Quite often there is a problem, but you can't see it. Next slide, please. That's Beirut, by the way. The biggest risks, the really catastrophic stuff, the stuff that people who worry about national infrastructure sort of might lay awake at night about, these risks tend to be unique. Each event is different, and they tend to be, fortunately, very infrequent. And indeed, some of them have never happened at all. They are quintessentially very low likelihood, very high impact risks. For reasons to do with psychology, which I'll touch on at the end, people find these really hard to grapple with. We're much more comfortable dealing with risks that happen quite a lot. A lot of the low-end cyber stuff is just happening all the time. It's in the news at the moment, Marks and Spencer's, the Co-op and so on. You know, nobody's died. We're more familiar with that. The stuff that might only happen once, you know, the 9/11 scale stuff and beyond, we're really uncomfortable with. Also, the way national resilience has been planned in the UK and elsewhere, I think, has been really unhelpful, and it is now changing. Traditionally, it has started with a risk scenario. A terrorist plants a bomb in this place, the bomb goes off, it causes this damage, it has these consequences. Let's have a really detailed plan for dealing with that scenario. But the problem is that when it does happen, it won't be like that. Each event is unique. And therefore, I think a rule of thumb is that the more detailed the plan, the more wrong it's going to be come the day. And actually, a better way of approaching this is the other way around. It's what are the capabilities that nationally we need to maintain and preserve? Let's not worry about the specific threat scenario that gave rise to it. Lots of different things could cause, for example, the electricity distribution system to fall over. Next slide, please. So the thing we have always worried about most is critical national infrastructure. It's worth saying, as a historical aside, that what's now called NPSA, previously CPNI, previously various other names, started life very early on in the Cold War. It started from a recognition that in the transition to war, this is Cold War Soviet Union days, that we would expect in the UK special forces attacks, sabotage attacks on critical national infrastructure in order to throw us into chaos before the military conflict started. And there was a recognition of the need to find out where these really supremely important points were and put protection around them. And that's been going on for more than half a century now. In the past, there used to be this taxonomy of critical national infrastructure sectors, transport, water, and sort of stuff that's vital for everyday life. Space was added several years ago, becoming extremely important now. It is shocking the extent to which everyday stuff that we all rely on depends on infrastructure up in space and indeed on Earth. And as we've heard also, I think now if we were redoing this, there'd be an underwater infrastructure sector in there as well, because most of the UK's communications traffic now comes on undersea cables. A lot of our energy, electricity, gas interconnectors and so on. These are all important. They're all massively interdependent, which is why NPSA doesn't sort of obsess about them anymore. It has a slightly more broad approach. If I had to pick out one, though, that I would start with, the one that sits at the bottom of it all is energy. If you take out electricity, most of the other ones fall over. Turn off the electricity very quickly. Not only have you got no government, no emergency services, no communications, no transport, you've quite quickly probably got no water as well, among other things. And we've had a little glimpse of this recently with the large-scale blackouts in Spain and Portugal, and on a much smaller scale, the fire at the substation in London, which took out Heathrow Airport for a day. Okay, next slide, please. So that's all the bad things that can happen. The response of the UK and other countries, and I think the Nordic states, I've done some work with colleagues in Norway and Sweden on this, and I take my hat off because they are way ahead. This whole of society approach to national resilience. So we all think resilience is a really good thing, but there are a few issues around it. First is, what the heck do we mean by it? With a colleague at the Norwegian Defence Organisation and at Imperial College, we've recently written a paper for RUSI about national resilience in the context of NATO, actually. And we found just in that sort of milieu of infrastructure protection, we came across no fewer than 93 different definitions of resilience. So there's a huge problem of just, what the heck does it mean? To pare it down to its bare minimum, I find that there are two broad meanings. Most people, when they talk about resilience, talk about a rather limited form of resilience. And I think the NATO definition broadly follows this, which I would refer to slightly disparagingly as passive resilience. This is the idea of resilience as bouncing back. There's been a disruptive event, a bomb's gone off, the lights have gone out, a war has started. And it's about recovering from that. So it's things like business continuity planning, disaster recovery, incident management, and so on. Very important to do, but it only starts after something bad has happened. There's a much more interesting form of resilience, which actually mimics what happens in the natural world with biological systems, which is active resilience, which is a continuous process of learning and toughening that goes on. So effectively, if you've got active resilience, which includes passive resilience, not only are you better at coping with crises, you're better at avoiding some crises as well, which is it's always better to prevent rather than cure the symptoms. Another big problem with resilience is that we're really good at measuring the cost, but not very good at measuring its value. And in the commercial context, this often means that investment decisions decide that there's no point in paying for it. To be resilient, you need things like big fat supply chains. Witness the war in Ukraine at the moment. You need the ability to generate lots of mass You need a lot of redundancy. You need lots of people. This costs money. There's a tension between resilience and efficiency. Efficiency often wins. Highly efficient systems with lean supply chains tend not to be very resilient, so there is a trade-off. It's really easy to measure the costs. It's harder to measure the value. One value of resilience, for example, is deterrence. If your adversary knows that they can keep punching you and you don't really care very much because you can deal with it, you're less of an attractive target. How do you measure that? As an aside, I was at a conference a couple of years ago about electricity supply system resilience, and there was a lot of good things were being said about how amazingly resilient the Ukrainian grid has been in the face of repeated, almost daily attacks by the Russians through drones and missiles. So the lights keep going out, the Ukrainians keep repairing it. There was a former Swedish government minister, energy minister there, who said, yeah, and it's interesting that the Swedish grid is surprisingly similar in scale and capacity to the Ukrainian grid, but in his view, it's much less resilient. It is super efficient. It's got a fraction of the scale of the workforce. He said the Ukrainian grid has benefited from a hangover from the Soviet legacy of having a massive workforce. So every time a substation gets blown up, they can send people out to fix it. In Sweden, he said they would find it much harder to cope with that. I imagine they're taking that into account. Next slide, please. I just want to mention two things at the end. One is trust. For all sorts of reasons I haven't got time to go into, if you want societal resilience, national resilience, you need high levels of trust, including trust in government. You also need that, by the way, in things like pandemics. This is from the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer, international comparisons. The UK, I'm afraid, again, has been slipping down, looking quite bad. This was before the 2024 general election, and we'd had, 4 prime ministers in 5 years. So this was during a period of political chaos. Maybe if you reran this year, we'd come out slightly better. You can see predictably that Sweden scores really well. Norway and other Baltic states, apart from Germany, aren't on this, but I would predict Norway would come out, really high. I must admit I'm slightly dubious about China and Saudi Arabia being up there as ultra high levels of trust. Final slide, just to throw a couple of things out there. Science can help. There are some really positive things that could be done. I've got a bit of a prejudice, which is that the world is run by humanities graduates, and that's certainly true for policymakers in the Whitehall context. And I think sometimes science, a mix of science, a slightly more diverse set of ideas can help. And I think there are two areas where science is extremely relevant here. One is understanding the behavior of complex adaptive systems. All the stuff we've been talking about, conflicts, societies, economies, businesses, organizations, terrorism, they're all properties of complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems have certain very interesting properties: emergence, sudden non-linear change, sensitivity to starting conditions. And yet, policymakers continue to be wedded to this linear model of change. A causes B, causes C, causes D. And they continue to be flummoxed by every time they decide on a policy intervention and pull the lever and expect an outcome in 3 years' time. It doesn't happen because life's a little bit more complicated than that. So I think the science of complex adaptive systems can really help to understand how we grapple with these problems, so-called wicked problems. And psychology. One of the reasons why we really aren't very good at resilience is because of characteristics of our own ways of thinking, deeply ingrained. Things like optimism bias and availability bias and loss aversion and sunk cost bias. These are things that systematically distort the way we perceive risks and the way we respond in crises and disasters. Psychologists have been studying them for decades. They're really quite well understood. There are practical ways of aiming off for them. And yet again, in the policy world, we plough on as though human decision makers were rational beings in possession of all the possible information, which is never true. And finally, trust, upon which a lot of this stuff relies. In my amateur view, Article 5 entirely relies on trust. Trust is a psychological state. There's nothing objective about trust. It's something that goes on in your mind. Again, it's been quite well studied. We know that it's quite slow and difficult to build. It's very easy to destroy. And in my mind, at least, there are issues now about the extent to which Article 5 has survived some of the recent developments. So again, I think science can bring something to bear there. That's more than enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, please, let's give a round of applause to all of our speakers for each of those contributions. Now, I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions. But before we go there, and we will, I promise, perhaps back to front, because I think there's certainly, I mean, throughout all of these presentations, of course, just now as well, a lot to really delve into there. Paul, I'm curious then. So you used, for example, you mentioned the Ukrainian grid as an example, compare that with Sweden, etc. I'd be curious how you regard the UK's grid here, because of course we've seen, this has obviously been a focus as well in the Baltic states, with the synchronization. We saw the synchronization of the Baltic grids, and there's of course a lot of discussion around that and what exactly it means and the implications of that. But while we have Paul here, given his experience, how would you rate, perhaps first on the UK grid specifically, but then in general, the current preparedness and resiliency perhaps of the UK in the context of these myriad threats?
Well, a big fat caveat, which is this is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the authorities here. Secondly, that I'm no longer directly involved in that element of the work, so I can only give you a sort of vicarious view. I think the important thing here is that people have been mindful of these risks for a long time, not just malicious acts like terrorism, for example, or hostile foreign state activity, but natural events. So, for example, a lot of work has gone on hardening the grid to deal with so-called Carrington events, which are extreme solar activity, named after an event that happened in the 19th century, which would, had it happened, 50 years later, have knocked out everything. So there's been a lot of work done over many decades to harden the most critical facilities. So we're not starting from scratch here. The inevitable problem with any nation attempting to do this is one that you should prepare to be surprised, because as I said, if you look at the really big catastrophic events that have happened over the last 50 years or so, they've had certain unique characteristics. So one's got to be slightly imaginative about the what-ifs. And secondly, there's always a trade-off in any economy between resilience and cost. So, for example, energy regulators have responsibility to ensure that energy supplies are resilient, but they also have a responsibility, particularly in a cost of living crisis, to ensure that, price to the consumer is kept down, and there's a trade-off between those two. My sense is that UK and other European countries have taken these issues very seriously over a number of decades, which is not to say that something bad couldn't happen, but that a lot of preparation has been done.
Right, thank you for that. And actually, Henrik, would you like to jump in and talk about that Baltic perspective as well?
Yeah. I was going. Yes, as you mentioned, in early February, Baltic states left the Russian electricity grid, which was and joined the continental European electricity grid through Poland, and that was basically the last remaining energy-related link we still had from the Soviet Union. The connection went well, and there are no problems itself, but of course the whole process and the discussions about the energy and the electricity in the Baltic countries has shown, certain, let's say, shortages or vulnerabilities we have. Because for a long and that's related to the changed security environment, because for a long time, one of the main principles was that because we are so close to the Nordic countries, which have a lot of cheap energy, especially coming from the Scandinavian hydro, this enables we can bring export electricity cheaper from outside. But for example, and linking to sabotages or accidents on the sea, one of actually the major one we have had is we have two electricity cables, Estlink 1 and 2, connecting Estonia and Finland. And in December last year, when was this Eagle S ship, which got several data cables, so it also got the one of those electricity cables. And if the Finns would not have stopped that ship, it could probably have got also the second one, because it was already approaching that one. And while the data cables are easy to repair, or relatively easy to repair, it usually takes few weeks, and the electricity ones are much more difficult, because it needs a very specialized equipment, which is an extremely short supply and pre-booked in the world, I understand. So, for example, if the cable was cut in December, it is still not functioning. The repairs are only now starting. I understand the deadline is July expected to return, and that has clearly already, for example, and continues to affect the electricity prices in not only in Estonia but also in Latvia, Lithuania, because the prices would be lower if that cable would work, because most of the time it comes electricity from Finland and the other Nordic electricity to our countries. So if you are such a geographically, let's say, exposed position, those incidents and the whole debate about the energy infrastructure, energy architecture has shown that you need to have your national some kind of stable reserve supplies on which you can rely on the time of a crisis. You cannot rely on connections which could, as we have seen, be easily, even accidentally, but certainly intentionally be cut. That's one of the lessons which has been clearly learned in the Baltics in the last year or two.
Thank you for that. I mean, that raises a couple of points. And of course, you mentioned kind of the Estlink 1 and 2 damage. Of course, there's the Baltic connector, which was taken offline for a very long time between Finland and Estonia. And I think you said there that if the Finns hadn't been as quick to act, then the damage could have been worse. Now, of course, in the context of the Eagle S, again, part of Russia's shadow fleet, it was in Finnish territorial waters, and the Finns had been closely monitoring it. So I guess two questions there. So what would happen then, as indeed has occurred in other incidents where it wasn't the incident didn't happen in territorial waters, where the vessel, for example, wasn't being monitored, or, right, because you mentioned during your earlier contribution, the case of that unflagged vessel, which was then escorted by the Russian fighter. So, of course, that also raises the question, well, if damage were to occur and we were to suspect, say, a vessel, for example, in the case of, say, the Nunu Polar Bear, in the case of Baltic Connector, or the Eagle S, in the case of Estlink 1 and 2, and then a power like Russia, say, were to come in and escort that vessel to ensure that, for example, in the case of the Finns, they couldn't board the vessel, etc. Mm-hmm. Where does that leave us? Because, of course, then you have other risks that immediately come into play. I know that's a lot, but I'm curious what your view is, and perhaps, Andy, you might have something to say on that as well.
Actually, starting concerning the Eagle S, the damage was done not in territorial waters, but actually on the economic zone of Finland.
Right, but the vessel was in territorial waters.
Yeah, but the Finns asked, or kind of ordered, or gave order to a ship to go to the territorial waters. The ship complied, and then the Finns boarded and took control of a ship. If a ship would not comply, like the one last week in case of Estonia, we don't know what would have happened. But the situations were, of course, different also, because in that case it was clearly, that the cables have been cut. You lost the connectivity, and it was clear it was still going to do more harm. The ship last week, it was flagless, but it wasn't doing any anchor dragging or any damage itself. So Estonian authorities decided, I don't know whether the original intention was to board it or not, but just to observe a ship and let it go in order, not especially if Russians were already active in the area. So this brings, I mean, this the whole legal complexity, which I alluded. I mean, we can go to long details here, of course, but the law of the sea, the UNCLOS, does not give you much formal powers, but there is also room for interpretation. And actually, one of the things the states of around the Baltic Sea, but also some other states, I think from the Nordic Sea, including Britain, for example, are working or trying to work to reach some kind of a more common legal and policy interpretation how to act in such a situations, because there is room for interpretation, and there are, I mean, different scenarios. One is immediate threat, another is just when you want to inspect a suspicious ship and so on. But the aim actually should be to have a common interpretation, because if a nation start to behave differently, I mean, I don't know, for example, Estonia tries to be rather forceful and try to control, but some our neighboring states, for example, would be much more lenient. I mean, that provides an opportunities for Russia or to actually test or divide us, certainly.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Andy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. There was a very good online seminar that touched on some of these points just recently, I seem to remember.
That was us. You can find it on our YouTube channel.
I note that the person who's the expert on the law of the sea amongst the three of us is not sat up here now. So I'll do my best. Not my area particularly, but I agree. I mean, one of the challenges here, undoubtedly, is that the law of the sea in general, you know, UNCLOS and the associated elements have a number of weaknesses, I think it's fair to say, not least in terms of its reflection on action on the seabed and how you can deal with it. So that contributes to the wider grey zone element here, your ability to pose a threat to the infrastructure in this case, and then and effectively get away with it because the means to deal with it efficiently is hampered by a weak legal context. As we touched on there are efforts to try and correct that. I don't underestimate the challenge there, I think. Even then, that might be a helpful but not complete step forward, because I'll go back to my sort of starting point. Beyond the action, for instance, of ships dragging anchors, the underwater poses that opportunity to hide, to obscurate, to make it really difficult to address the actions of a potentially hostile actor, and so it will still offer a real opportunity for actors, you know, to do bad things. So tightening up the legal position, I think, will be helpful, but not sufficient. Albeit you're starting to make it progressively harder for people to act, and that's probably no bad thing.
Great, thank you. Now, that gives us just over 20 minutes for questions from the audience here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We have someone with a microphone going around. Please state your name and your affiliation before asking a question. So, if anyone would like to ask a question to our panel here, please raise your hand. Yes, we have a question at the back, right there.
Donato Skupčuna, Center for Geopolitics. I wanted to ask the last speaker, maybe he could disclose the names for these numbers in one of the graphs in your presentation where you had threats and likelihood on x-axis.
If you just go to gov.uk, it's on the web. It's the National Risk Register 2025. It's a public document.
Thanks, I'll look it up.
And I saw another hand over there.
Hello, I'm Niles Webb. I'm a PhD student at Polis. So I've got a question especially for Henrik, I suppose. So I'm sorry if I've not got your name correct. I think I do, sorry. So you were talking about how Belarus and Russia have weaponized immigration and refugee flows, and I'm particularly aware of how Russia has also weaponized narratives about minority rights in certain countries. And I'm wondering if we need to be considering this a potential weak spot in our resilience in terms of social cohesion, perhaps. Russia invests a lot of its resources in trying to upset that social cohesion in various countries. And the reason why countries are investing so much in trying to promote that cohesion, including in the UK, as we've seen in recent weeks, is because it does matter in terms of where they need to direct future resources. And I'm wondering, especially, that in theory, organizations like the OSCE were created in such a way as to deal with all of these issues of minorities being in countries that they didn't necessarily identify with the prevalent nationalism of, and there are these sort of social fissures which are partly the legacy of sort of Soviet manipulation of identity in the region. And I'm wondering, what are the sort of key vulnerabilities in this area, and do we have the institutions to sort of deal with these issues at an either national or international scale?
Thank you very much, Henrik.
Okay, yeah, Russia obviously is instrumentalizing the Russian diasporas abroad, and of course Baltic states and Estonia and Latvia in particular have a biggest numbers of such a diasporas. The Russian aim is clearly not to do everything or what is possible, not to allow their full integration into the society. So we try to keep them separately, kind of a Russian cultural sphere. For example, in Estonia, we have currently from last year now, finally after 35 years of re-established of independence, gone to the last stages of basically going over to the general united Estonian language school of public school, because so far still the pockets, large pockets actually in some areas of Russian language school, which also had, of course, Estonian language to a certain degree existed, and a lot of those teachers were actually educated either in the Soviet system or even in the modern Russia, and with them comes this kind of ideology, and even if the textbooks are Estonian, the mentality and so on comes very much from Russia. So it's a kind of a long-term processes to tackle. Another issue is related to it is the Russia's use of Orthodox Church, which is certainly a vehicle, as we have seen also in Ukraine, and has been traditionally been connected with the Russian state and the Russian secret services already from the time of Joseph Stalin, and here again Estonia is currently, there are still some legal disputes, but in the process of a sort of a delinking there. The church, we have two Orthodox churches. One is under Constantinople, but the biggest one is still related to a Moscow Patriarchate, where it's Metropolitan, who is not currently anymore in Estonia, but was sent from Russia, had nothing to do with Estonia before, and so the process is going on delinking that church from the institution which advocates actively for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and beyond of that. But those, of course, long-term processes. They have been facilitated, with the change of a mood or a kind of a change of dynamic since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine in 2022. But it's a long process.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Alex Malingrad. I'm a master's student at LSE. I think probably one of the main sort of features of the Ukraine conflict has been the shift in the character of war in the use of unmanned or now seemingly more autonomous vehicles, right? Particularly in the low and slow small UAS platforms. But I was wondering in terms of how this applies to the sea domain, right, and the undersea domain. We've seen sort of Russian unmanned underwater vehicles such as the Poseidon being developed. And I was wondering if you could answer that from sort of three perspectives. One, the risk perspective, because there's been a lot of talk about dragging of anchors, but what are the risks that these systems pose? The risk management perspective in terms of what role these systems could play in terms of if we field them for risk management, for observation, right? What I know in Ukraine, for example, there have been issues with plot fusion and sensor fusion in terms of existing air defense systems. So how do we make sure that our sensor systems, right, can actually keep up and track these systems, right? And also from a national resilience perspective, Paul, you know, we have bollards and stuff and outside stadiums. How do you deal with emerging actors, whether they're state or non-state actors, who might be taking, you know, we now have videos on YouTube of UAS systems in Ukraine fighting through EW, right? It's those sort of jamming guns probably aren't as effective as they were even 2 years ago. So how do you adapt to these from a resilience perspective as well?
Thank you very much. Who would like to take that first?
There's a lot in there, dare I say, and I'm not going to, almost certainly not going to do it justice in a couple of minutes, but I'll give it a go. So as a general premise, you're starting, as your point is absolutely right. We've seen an awful lot of innovation, particularly in this sort of uncrewed air and what we might call one-way drones, either with munitions or for sensing in Ukraine. Several factors at play there, one of which is a really strong lean back into existing relatively low-cost civilian technology and just fielding that quickly. And obviously low cost means your relative comfort with attrition is very high, so long as you can keep the supply chain going. And we've seen a lot of that. There have been other bits of innovation, and I touched on that sort of that cycle, that loop of technological innovation and change, action and counteraction from both sides. In a number of areas, this is a really good one. I would perhaps just temper that to note there are plenty of examples where things really haven't moved on, and who thought we'd see troops digging into trenches, sandbags, and the rest of it. So some things move really quickly, and other things don't move at all in that sense. So that's just a temper, lest we think there's a sudden radical change all over the place. In the underwater environment, this has been a technology that so uncrewed systems in the underwater environment, remote and autonomous, has been something that's been developing variously, and also in surface craft. We've seen examples of the use of autonomous and remote surface craft in the Black Sea as part of the wider Ukraine conflict. Obviously pre-exist that conflict, but some of the thinking and technology that's spun out of the experiences of Ukraine undoubtedly play back into that environment as well. So the curve, if anything, has increased. Might have done anyway, but it's certainly increased as a result of that experience. Risks posed by them, uncrewed and autonomous systems in the underwater environment, yes, absolutely very real. A host of potential use cases, ranging from surveillance to creating a mass, which is a real problem to deal with. If cost is relatively low, then you can field many of them in the environment at one time, which obviously creates a problem. We touched on seabed actors and action there, and that's a use case for remote and autonomous underwater craft. There is also the opportunity to counter them using a similar sort of so that cycle of innovation and counter innovation applies equally in this environment, and it's definitely something that Western militaries are getting after as well. I'll very quickly talk about the sort of the fusion, the network and fusion sort of point that you touched on, and then I'll perhaps hand over on the resilience thing. If anything, I think that is the area that is most interesting It's all very well being able to field a new technology and, particularly in that sort of one-way sense, field it and get some sort of effect out of it. But the ability to join it all up and to be able to synergize all that data and information, to be able to act really quickly, has been an ambition for a long time. And those who sort of cast your minds back, 30 years we were talking about that ambition. It's been a bit slow to come off, but the experience in Ukraine undoubtedly has accelerated that. And it's absolutely the front of thinking Western militaries as well, of which the underwater environment is absolutely part, albeit recognising that poses some very particular technical challenges that perhaps don't exist on the surface and in the air. And I'll stop at that, but I mean, there's oodles there.
I think that's covered it beautifully. I've got very little to add. I mean, it's an illustration of the general point about the dynamic and adaptive nature of the risks, the perpetual arms race. It's a particularly interesting one. Now, with the use of machine learning and AI, we're already well into autonomous vehicles, subsea, aerial, and terrestrial. There's a lot of research going on into this, into detection and countermeasures. So we are in a sort of classic small A arms race with this. We've seen it obviously in the military context in Ukraine, but there's a general rule of thumb, informal rule of thumb, that says if you see a capability appear in a state actor, you should prepare to see that capability start to appear in other threat actors, such as, for example, some terrorist organizations or some serious organized crime groups within a few years. I would say that cycle, that process of osmosis is probably speeded up. There's also what again is referred to, I think sometimes slightly inappropriately, as the kind of democratization of some of these technologies. Stuff that starts off as very expensive state level or military kit ends up being kind of really cheap, cheerful stuff you can buy on Amazon. It's dual use at very low cost. But rest assured, there are lots of really clever people trying to develop a way of staying ahead of the threat.
Great, thank you. There was a question here. So if we could just have.
Thank you. I'm Mary Dejevsky. I'm a visiting journalist, but I'm here for background, not to report, just to reassure you. I've got two things. One of them to Paul Martin. You said very tantalizingly that the COVID inquiry had thrown up examples of really pretty dreadful preparation or gaps in protection of infrastructure. And I would like you to expand on that if you could. Also, to add to maybe what was said about Ukraine and resilience, I think it's been very interesting watching this from the side, that Russia in a way has taken on one of maybe two countries, Ukraine and Belarus, that had the Soviet-era protection and resilience for preparing for eventual war. And so what you're looking at is not just the resilience of the grid, but also the pipelines. The gas pipelines were operating until they were actually stopped by Ukraine at the beginning of this year. And the way the air raid shelters and the undergrounds were repurposed and all that was done incredibly quickly. I mean, it was done practically within hours of the Russian invasion. And I think it showed, in a way, a sort of Soviet, the vestiges of Soviet-era preparation for those sort of things. Thank you.
I would agree with you on the second point, and you're back to that in that tension. It's not simple, but there is a degree of tension between cost efficiency and resilience. As I say, it's not quite that simple. It's not always a direct trade-off. There are ways of sort of optimizing where you get quite a lot of resilience without a lot of extra cost. On the COVID inquiry, I'm just simply kind of reflecting what I've read in the media. The COVID inquiry is all in the public domain. There's been a lot of media coverage of it. I don't think the UK was unique in any respect. I think the jury's still out. It depends what your metric of success or failure is. Number of deaths, the period over which, hospitals were, overcrowded and so on. So, but I do believe that what we discovered, and the UK was not unique in this by any means, was that we were not as well prepared as we thought we were. And that if I was being a bit critical, I'd say what we've been good at, by we I mean governments, has been admiring the problem. We're very good at writing elegant descriptions of the risks and producing frameworks and documents full of phrases like, we should and we need to, and we will deliver and we are committed to. But some of this stuff requires very long-term planning, and our democratic cycles, make that really hard to invest huge amounts of money where the payoffs might be very hard to see at all and might require programs of work over periods of many years or even decades. So it's really quite hard for governments to do that. And again, I don't think there's anything particularly peculiar about the UK in that regard. The Nordics, quite rightly, are held up as shining examples of national and societal resilience. And I love congratulating my Norwegian and Swedish friends, but they will then turn around and say to me, yeah, but it's easy in a country of 6 million people where we all know each other and there's very high levels of trust. Country of 60, 70 million people, it's a harder thing to do.
Great, thank you. Any further questions? Good, well, I have one. So I think in the last maybe few minutes that we have, just very quick, because Paul, you mentioned deterrence. And I realize this is something that following panels will explore further. But of course, Paul, you said deterrence is, of course, a key aspect here. And I would like to hear a bit more, perhaps from each of our speakers on this. And then, related to that, perhaps kind of a dual query, on the role of, for example, transnational, as you have, the EU, for example, NATO, as well as potentially other civil society and private sector actors, and how they could also contribute to fostering greater resilience in general here. Whoever would like to go first, just final words on any of those topics.
Okay, let me start concerning the deterrence. Of course, if we speak about deterrence, there are also two parts of the deterrence. One is deterrence by denial, and one is deterrence by punishment once you are already attacked or could be attacked. The resilience, of course, being the key in deterrence by denial. And I fully agree what was before said, that resilience should not be seen just about recovering from the attack, but actually building systems which are so, let's say, attack-proof in many ways that the adversary would lose point of spending its own resources, which are always still limited also. It might be a very, very big, but there is still always a judgment that used. But even more difficult we are usually with the deterrence by punishment aspects, but even if attacks are done, usually our responses are beyond maybe naming, but of course, for example, if we speak about Russia has long lost this kind of a shame for things. Maybe China is more interested still in its international image and to not want to expose, but Russia certainly does not care anymore if it is caught. So thought should be also given to different means of punishment, whether be they sanctions or restrictive measures or some kind of other covert measures, obviously, which would not be talked in the public, but best should become more proficient in using the whole toolbox, not just the defensive measures.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to agree. And I think deterrence in general is one of those subjects that's definitely come back into, my sense has come back into much sharper focus than it perhaps had done a few years ago, with a very broad view about the various means and approaches one can take to deterring in general. I would include in that sense nuclear deterrence. Forgive me, I'll get stuck on a familiar topic for me. The sense of narrative and discourse about the nature and role of nuclear deterrence in Europe is a very different one, I think, than it was, say, 10 years ago. A subject that I sense at least sat in the background of many people's minds and really wasn't part of the common narrative. To see that at least being openly discussed and examined in forums such as this and elsewhere, I think is a good indicator of the nature of the shift and our wider focus on deterring writ large. So, I mean, I think a really fascinating lens through which to view our sort of security challenges across Europe at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. Paul.
I agree with all of that. Deterrence obviously applies to geopolitical conflict, but it applies in other contexts. So, for example, in protective security, there's a sort of dark art known as deterrence communication, where the aim is to, through things like public communications, to say things that are broadly reassuring to the public, but will send a message to potential threat actors that, you shouldn't come here. How you do it depends a lot on who you're trying to deter. So, how risk averse are they? How much do they believe what you're saying? Are they deterred by the prospects of being detected? Or are they deterred by the prospects of being caught and punished in some way? It's really important to do. It's often a sort of added bonus to security or military capability, and it is notoriously hard to measure, and therefore sometimes isn't, I think, given sufficient weight. And I do agree it's become very much now a central issue again. During the Cold War, there was a huge amount of really interesting research done into this, which I think we need to go back and dig around in. Circumstances are different, but some of the underlying concepts. And like trust, it's a mind game. It's something that goes on in people's heads.
Great. Well, I think on that note, leave you kind of tantalizingly prepared for the next panel. We'll end that. Please join me in giving a very warm round of thanks to our esteemed panelists here today. And then please have some coffee at the back and refresh yourself for the next panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.